August 1812. Admiral Sir John Warren stood in the marble halls of the Admiralty, studying the global deployment charts that stretched across mahogany tables like a spider's web of British dominance. 600 Royal Navy warships patrolled every ocean from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, their white ensigns snapping in salt winds that had carried British victory for over 2 centuries. The numbers told an impossible story of supremacy. Against Britain's maritime colossus, the upstart United States possessed exactly 16 naval vessels, barely enough to patrol their own coastline. Warren's fingers traced the Atlantic shipping lanes where His Majesty's frigates intercepted American merchantmen with mechanical precision, their holds stuffed with contraband bound for Napoleon's Europe. In the officers' mess of HMS Shannon, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Napier raised his glass of port to toast another successful week of captures. 16 ships, he laughed to his fellow captains, against the greatest navy the world has ever known. The crystal clinked against mahogany as London's morning papers rustled with dismissive commentary about American naval pretensions. The Times of London had captured the prevailing mood perfectly, describing the American frigate constitution as nothing more than a bundle of pine boards sailing under a bit of striped bunting. British naval officers passed the clipping between wardrooms, chuckling at the audacity of colonials who dared challenge Nelson's heirs with vessels cobbled together from New World timber. No British frigate captain could recall a single instance of surrender to American colours. The very concept violated the natural order established at Trafalgar, reinforced through decades of victories against French, Spanish, and Dutch fleets. The Royal Navy's frigate service represented the elite of maritime warfare, fast, experienced, and utterly confident in their tactical superiority. Warren closed the deployment folder with satisfaction. By autumn, the American coast would be sealed tighter than Bonaparte's continental system. Their pathetic collection of frigates would either be captured, blockaded in port, or sent to the bottom, where they belonged. The morning sun slanted through tall windows, illuminating maps where red pins marked British positions and blue pins showed American vessels. The ratio told its own story. Overwhelming, mathematical, inevitable dominance. Captain James Richard Dacres adjusted his spyglass as HMS Guerriere cut through the Atlantic swells 400 miles southeast of Halifax. At 24, he possessed the supreme confidence of a third-generation naval officer whose father had commanded fleets in the Caribbean. The Guerriere's quarterdeck felt familiar beneath his boots, French oak captured from Napoleon's navy, now flying British colours after her violent seizure by HMS Blanche 6 years prior. His sailing master approached with the noon observations, noting their position as 40 N 55 Jadu. You. Dacres nodded absently, his attention fixed on the distant sail materializing through the summer haze. The stranger's profile suggested an American frigate, exactly the quarry every Royal Navy captain dreamed of encountering. "Signal our intentions to engage," Dacres commanded, ignoring the cautious glances exchanged between his officers. The Guerriere carried 263 men and boys, with her foremast already weakened from previous encounters and her crew depleted by prize parties sent aboard captured merchantmen. Yet these tactical disadvantages barely registered in Dacres' calculations. He summoned the American prisoners confined below decks, including Captain William Orne of the captured brig Betsy. As the Constitution drew closer, her massive profile becoming unmistakable, Dacres' excitement grew rather than diminished. "I hoped she would act bravely," he told Orne with barely contained eagerness, "as I should acquire more honor in taking her." The mathematics should have sobered any prudent commander. Constitution displaced over 1,100 tons more than Guerriere, carried 470 crew members compared to his 263, and mounted 30 24-pounder long guns against his 30 18-pounders. But Dacres saw only opportunity where others might have seen suicide. By taking the first American frigate on the station, he declared to his assembled officers, "I should be made an admiral. I should be made for life." The promise of promotion, prize money, and immortal glory clouded any tactical assessment of the approaching Leviathan. His decision to detach from Commodore Broke's squadron had been calculated risk-taking. Now, with Constitution bearing down under full sail, that gamble would determine whether James Richard Dacres joined the pantheon of British naval heroes, or became the first Royal Navy captain to strike his colours to American guns. 15 years earlier, in the Philadelphia shipyard where Constitution's keel first touched its cradle, naval architect Joshua Humphreys had unleashed a revolution disguised as traditional frigate construction. His radical design philosophy rejected centuries of European naval orthodoxy. If America couldn't match European numbers, her frigates must overmatch any frigate and, by their superior sailing, to escape from a ship of the line. The secret lay buried in Georgia's coastal swamps, where enslaved workers harvested live oak timber that weighed 75 pounds per cubic foot, denser than water, heavier than any wood European shipbuilders had encountered. Unlike the spaced timber frames of British frigates, Constitution's live oak ribs were bolted together in pairs with barely 3 inches between each massive beam, creating an impenetrable bed of timber over 22 inches thick at the waterline. 60 acres of carefully selected trees had been consumed in Constitution's construction: longleaf pine from South Carolina for her decks, white oak planking over live oak framing, and 150,000 black locust tree nails driven through timbers that resembled fortress walls more than ship construction. Humphreys' diagonal rider system transferred the crushing weight of 30 24-pounder long guns directly to the keel, preventing the hull sagging that plagued conventional frigates armed with such heavy ordnance. British naval historian William James would later marvel at the mathematical impossibility. The relative stoutness of top sides cannot be fully expressed by feet and inches. While the timbers of the American 44 are placed as close together as they well can be, there is considerable space between each timber of the British 38. Constitution displaced 2,200 tons fully loaded compared to Guerriere's lighter construction, creating a floating fortress that masqueraded as a conventional frigate. The Americans had weaponized their forests into naval architecture that European eyes couldn't decipher from a distance. As Constitution's 175-foot waterline approached through the Atlantic haze, her true nature remained hidden beneath familiar sail patterns and traditional rigging. At 5 p.m., Guerriere's starboard battery erupted in thunder and smoke as Dacres opened the deadly dance at 800 yards. Through the acrid haze, his crew watched their 18-pounder shot arc toward the American frigate's hull, then gasped as the iron balls struck Constitution's live oak flanks and bounced harmlessly into the Atlantic like pebbles thrown against a fortress wall. "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron!" screamed an American sailor from Constitution's gun deck, his voice carrying across the narrowing gap between the ships. British gunners frantically sponged and reloaded, their training taking over even as their minds struggled to process the impossible sight of their shot, failing to penetrate what appeared to be conventional frigate construction. Captain Hull paced Constitution's quarterdeck with predatory patience, ordering his gunners to hold fire as the distance closed from 600 yards to 400 to 200. His crew had practiced this moment through 2 weeks of daily drills, waiting for half-pistol shot range where Constitution's 30 24-pounders could unleash their full devastation. At 25 yards, Hull's voice cut through the battle noise. "Now, boys, pour it into them!" Constitution's starboard battery exploded in a synchronized inferno that sent every spar trembling and shook the massive frigate from stem to stern. The double-shotted broadside, 60 iron balls weighing 24 pounds each, struck Guerriere's lighter construction like a sledgehammer against pine boards. Guerriere's mizzenmast toppled overboard in a tangle of rigging and canvas, dragging the British frigate around like a sea anchor and exposing her vulnerable stern to Constitution's raking fire. Hull's gunners poured shot after shot through Guerriere's length, each impact sending splinters exploding across British gun decks, where men fell screaming or lay silent. Within 30 minutes of intensive bombardment, Guerriere's foremast and mainmast crashed down in sequence, leaving the once proud frigate a helpless hulk wallowing in the Atlantic swells. British return fire had carved through Constitution's rigging and punched holes in her lighter upperworks, but her live oak fortress remained essentially intact. The mathematical superiority that Dacres had dismissed now expressed itself in brutal arithmetic. 15 British dead versus 7 Americans, 57 British wounded versus 7 Americans. Through the settling gun smoke, Captain Dacres surveyed the floating wreckage that had been HMS Guerriere just minutes before. Blood seeped through his uniform where an American musket ball had torn into his back during the failed boarding attempt, each breath sending fresh waves of agony through his wounded body. Around him, the quarterdeck resembled a slaughterhouse, splintered planking mixed with pools of crimson where his officers had fallen. The mathematical reality of his situation struck with brutal clarity. 3 masts gone, hull holed below the waterline, 57 of his crew dead or wounded. Guerriere wallowed helplessly in the Atlantic swells, her gun ports awash as seawater poured through the American shot holes. In the distance, Constitution sailed with majestic indifference, her crew already repairing minor rigging damage, while Dacres' ship disintegrated beneath his feet. When Hull's lieutenant climbed aboard through the wreckage and formally inquired about surrender, Dacres could only gesture helplessly at the devastation surrounding them. "Well, sir, I don't know," he replied with bitter irony. "Our mizzen-mast is gone. Our fore and mainmasts are gone. I think on the whole you might say we have struck our flag." The young captain who had dreamed of Admiralty and eternal glory now faced the unthinkable task of formally surrendering his sword to American hands. Yet when Hull refused the blade, declaring he could not accept surrender from a man who had fought so gallantly, Dacres experienced a moment of confusion that cut deeper than his physical wounds. Even in defeat, the Americans displayed a magnanimity that his own service had never taught him to expect from colonial upstarts. As Constitution's crew transferred Guerriere's survivors aboard their ship, Dacres watched his mother's Bible, the most precious possession in his cabin, placed carefully in his hands by Hull's personal order. The gesture of respect felt more devastating than any broadside, forcing him to confront the collapse of every assumption about American naval incompetence that had driven him to this catastrophic engagement. The dispatch reached London's Admiralty building on September 7th, carried by HMS Shannon's fastest courier through autumn rain that drummed against the tall windows of Whitehall. First Sea Lord Robert Saumarez read Captain Dacres' formal report twice before summoning his staff, each reading confirming the impossible. HMS Guerriere had struck her colours to an American frigate. Within hours, the news spread through London's coffeehouses and naval clubs like a contagion of disbelief. At Lloyd's of London, maritime insurers suspended their usual calculations as underwriters struggled to process intelligence that violated every actuarial table they possessed. The Royal Navy had not lost a frigate action in living memory, certainly never to Americans whose naval tradition stretched back barely 2 decades. The Times of London captured the nation's stunned reaction in stark typography. Never before in the history of the world did an English frigate strike to an American. Editorial writers fumbled for explanations that might preserve British naval prestige. Defective masts, overwhelming odds, treacherous weather conditions, anything except American naval superiority. Behind closed doors at the Admiralty, emergency conferences convened as senior officers grappled with strategic implications that extended far beyond a single ship loss. If one American frigate could destroy HMS Guerriere, what did this suggest about the other 5 vessels in their original frigates program? More disturbing still, what did it reveal about British assumptions regarding colonial shipbuilding capabilities? The institutional response came with bureaucratic swiftness that betrayed deeper panic. New standing orders prohibited British frigates from engaging American 44-gun ships in single combat, a policy reversal that acknowledged American naval parity for the first time in British maritime history. Additional squadrons received deployment orders for the American coast, their mission to prevent any repetition of August 19th's catastrophe. In the hallowed halls where Nelson's victories still echoed, senior officers now faced an uncomfortable truth. The colonials had built something entirely new under familiar frigate rigging, and the Royal Navy's centuries of supremacy no longer guaranteed victory against American innovation. As Constitution's victory bells echoed across Boston Harbor on August 30th, 1812, few witnesses understood they had glimpsed the future of global naval power. Hull's triumph represented more than tactical success. It unveiled an American industrial philosophy that would reshape maritime warfare for the next century. The live oak fortress that had shattered British assumptions at sea reflected deeper capabilities that European powers had fatally underestimated. Within months, American shipyards from Portsmouth to Baltimore accelerated construction of vessels designed on Humphreys' revolutionary principles. The Old Ironsides legend sparked a national awakening to naval possibilities, transforming public perception from coastal defense to offensive maritime power. Congress approved expanded frigate programs, while inventors like Robert Fulton proposed steam-powered warships that would render traditional sailing navies obsolete. The psychological reverberations extended far beyond single-ship duels. British naval historian William James later admitted that American frigate victories taught the world that skill and courage are not the exclusive property of any one nation, a grudging acknowledgement that centuries of Royal Navy dominance no longer guaranteed victory against American innovation. European naval architects began studying Constitution's construction methods, recognizing that New World resources had produced Old World naval supremacy. Most significantly, the battle established a pattern of American technological surprise that would define future conflicts. Just as Constitution's live oak construction shocked British gunners in 1812, American industrial might would later astonish German U-boat commanders, Japanese pilots, and Soviet strategists who underestimated Yankee ingenuity. The floating fortress that Captain Dacres had dismissed as pine boards under striped bunting had revealed the first glimpse of American power that would dominate the 20th century's greatest naval battles. The revolution, disguised as a frigate duel, had announced America's arrival as a technological superpower that enemies would continue to underestimate at their peril.